What's up, you guys, and welcome back to another Halloween video. I hope you guys are enjoying it so far. This video is insane, and I'm so excited to talk about this story because you guys know I like to usually include one not necessarily true crime story, just something that's absolutely out there and bizarre. This is what we're talking about today. This is my one out there topic, and I actually struggled really hard on what exactly to cover for my non-true crime topic, and then one of you guys ended up leaving a comment somewhere, either here or Instagram, asking me to do more like survival stories. My husband ended up stumbling upon the survival story of Juliane Koepcke. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, and everything I've found has been in German, so they haven't really made it much easier to understand. This is one that's going to bother those of you that are already scared of flying, and for those of you that don't want to be scared of flying, probably don't watch this video. So let's just start at the beginning. So Julianne's father, Hans, was a biologist, and his dream was to do work in the jungle, research work. But he had absolutely no money. He had absolutely no passport. I'm pretty sure he was living in Germany at the time. I could be wrong. I couldn't find too many details on her parents in specific. But either way, he ended up sneaking himself into a salt cargo shipment sort of deal and ended up getting to South America that way. So he ended up getting to South America, and he crossed the entire continent on foot in order to finally make it to the jungles in Peru, where his research dreams finally came true. And no one has drive to live out their dreams like that anymore. I swear, that is one of the most impressive stories I've heard in a while. He ended up meeting another zoological scientist named Maria, and they fell in love and went on to have Julianne on October 10th of 1954 in Lima, Peru. Because of her parents' love for the jungle, they had an ecological station in Pucallpa. Again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. She basically grew up in the Peruvian jungle. She learned absolutely everything there was to learn about the jungle. She knew how to get her own food. She knew how to navigate the jungle. She knew how to navigate the rivers. She even raised her own exotic animals. I think she had a toucan that she was raising. I have a picture of it. She grew up learning things that a lot of people don't get to learn in their lifetime, and this would end up saving her life. Now, she ended up going to high school in Lima, Peru. From what I'm understanding, her family spent little spurts of time at the ecological station, but they mainly lived in Peru, so this is where she went to high school, and she ended up graduating in December of 1971. Now, apparently, in Lima, Peru, you don't have prom until after you graduate, and she wanted to go to prom. She did not want to miss it. It was right before Christmas, and Hans had actually gone to the ecological station, and the prom was on the 23rd of December, so she had to beg her mom to let her stay and stay with her, and then they had plans to just head over to the ecological station on the 24th once prom was over. They were going to book a flight and be there with him for Christmas. Julianne and her mother ended up having to book a flight through Airlines, and this is where this turns into an absolute nightmare. This airline had a horrific reputation, and I'm not talking like Spirit Airlines where everyone's flight gets canceled and that's it. They only had, at this point, one plane in operable condition because of the amount of crashes in their history. And the second plane that they had been being fixed for an extended period of time. The previous crash had just happened not too long before their flight, and apparently the pilots that were piloting the plane did not even have their pilot's license, and they had overpacked the plane by, I think, around 10 people. And then it was found out that all of their mechanics that were taking care of these planes, taking care of these very intricate plane engines, had only ever worked on motorcycles before. So essentially, everyone that worked for Lufthansa Airlines had no idea what they were doing. Julianne and her mother, Maria, they were worried, but they didn't want to be too worried, and at this point, they were just really desperate to spend Christmas together as a family, and the flight from Lima, Peru to Pucallpa was only about an hour long. They figured nothing bad can happen in that short of a distance, they'll be fine. Now, when they got to the airport, there were tons of people there, and there was really bad weather at the time, so every single flight had been canceled, at least temporarily canceled. And people were mad. This is Christmas Eve. Everyone wants to get home with their family. Julianne and her mother's flight was the only flight to actually leave the airport on Christmas Eve, I believe, and even on time. So this was a huge deal. And they felt incredibly lucky. They're thinking, you know, all these people have to sit here in this airport. They don't get to see their family. They're probably not going to be on time for Christmas. And they thought they were really living it up because they were the ones that were lucky enough to have a flight that was working. But that is not at all how it ended up. The first 25 minutes of the flight were completely fine. I believe it was flight 508, Lanza flight 508. They were given breakfast, I think a sandwich and something to drink. But then out of nowhere, clouds started to form, which is pretty typical when you're flying over the jungle, which is exactly what they were doing. But then eventually the plane flew directly into darkness at a little after 11 a.m. They had gone into a black cloud, and the only thing providing any light in the cabin was the flashes of lightning. Everyone began to panic because the turbulence picked up, and it wasn't just regular turbulence. This was terrifying. Pretty much everybody's worst nightmare. The plane was being thrown around so bad that all of the overhead bins eventually opened. There were Christmas presents flying around the plane, people's suitcases. People were getting smacked with items, basically. Being at a window seat over the wing, Julianne pretty much could see everything that was going on outside of the plane, and she ended up witnessing the lightning strike one of the engines. The last thing that she heard her mother say at this point was, "This is the end." The plane started to nosedive and everybody was screaming in horror. At this point, pretty much everyone knew they were about to die. This plane was going down. And then out of nowhere, Julianne remembers suddenly not being inside the plane anymore, but being outside of the plane, still strapped to her seat, free falling from 10,000 feet above the Peruvian jungle. She noticed that all three of the seats were still together, but her mother was no longer beside her, and the man that had been sitting at the end of the aisle was not there either. Eventually, the seats flipped to face her downwards, so all she could see was the jungle basically spiraling up towards her. And then eventually, because of the pressure and what was happening, the seatbelt squeezing her, she couldn't breathe, and she went unconscious. She fell a total of over 2 miles down to the jungle floor. While she was unconscious, she had 2 dreams. And in the second one, she remembers feeling very dirty. She felt like she was covered in mud and she was wet, and all she wanted was to just take a bath. And she remembers in the dream thinking, this is so stupid, like all I have to do is go walk over to the bathtub. It's literally right there. And so she got up in her dream, walked over to the bathtub, and all of a sudden she snapped back to and realized she was in the middle of the jungle and she had survived. She had survived a 2-mile free fall from a freaking airplane strapped to an airplane seat. It had rained the entire time. She was caked in mud and soaking wet, which is likely why she ended up having that dream. And she realized she likely had a pretty bad concussion. She could not move. She at some point must have woken up, at least she believes she had, because she was not buckled in the seat any longer. But it was almost as if, you know, she had landed and then unbuckled herself and fallen out. It wasn't like she had just completely, you know, come away from the seat, because she was laying right underneath of it. But she barely could move. Every time she tried to move, her vision would totally go out. Her head was absolutely pounding, and it was really, really hard for her to see because she had free fallen with no goggles or anything on, and it had busted so many different blood vessels in her eyes. They were bloodshot red. Her left eye was entirely swollen shut, and her right eye only had a tiny little bit in it that she could see out of. Her glasses had come off in all of this. So she kind of just scooched herself up underneath the shelter of the seats as much as possible and just laid there for the rest of the night and into the next morning. When she finally again attempted to get up, the first couple of tries were not good. She just continuously would start to black out. And then she finally pushed herself up enough and noticed that her mother was not in the seat beside her. The man, again, was still not there. And from what she could see from looking around her, they weren't anywhere near her either. She started to take in her injuries, and she realized that her clavicle was badly broken on one side. She had about an inch deep gash in her leg, but she remembers finding it so odd because the wound was huge and deep, but it was not bleeding at all. She had a couple of other small scratches, obviously all over her body, but nothing too crazy. She realized the first thing she wanted to do was basically to find her mom, but she knew she also needed food. She needed to find some sort of civilization somewhere. She needed to save herself, essentially. She started off into the woods, but not before she memorized every single thing about where she had landed. She remembered all of the details of the trees and the way that the leaves were and the way that the branches were when the sun was shining through them. She made sure she memorized every single portion of where she had fallen because she knew how easy it was to get really turned around in the jungle. And what's so terrifying about this is that the ecological station was only 30 minutes away from the crash site, and she had absolutely no idea. She started off on foot, and it took until I believe day 3 for her to find really any other evidence, big evidence at least, of the crash. On day 3, she ended up finding one of the engines, and then on day 4, she found another row of seats with passengers that did not survive the crash. She knew very well that none of these were going to be her mother because her mother was strapped in beside her and she wouldn't have been strapped in another seat, but she checked them just in case, and this is when it really hit her that she was alone and she had no idea where her mother is. She tried so hard to find her mom, but she finally realized at this point she had to save herself, that if she stayed around this area any longer, she would die. So she started off. She managed to find a bag of candy at the crash site, and this is the only thing that she had for any sort of caloric intake. She knew the first thing that she really needed to look for while in the jungle and lost was the sound of water, because if she was able to find a small stream that led to a river, that led to a bigger river, she eventually would find civilization. And pretty quickly, she ended up hearing a small trickle and followed it. She kept following the sound of water for days, and she said that at this point she didn't even feel any fear anymore. Her instinct to survive had been the only thing to kick in at this point. That's all she was thinking about, was surviving and moving forward and not stopping and protecting herself. She also made sure to start taking into account all of the different animals that she was seeing around her. She loved animals. I mean, her parents were biologists. And pretty quickly, she heard the sound of a bird. Now, I've seen multiple different names for this bird, but I've seen the most common thing it's called is sometimes like a king vulture, I think. And she was very familiar with this. And the reason it excited her to hear it so much was because they congregated around large bodies of water. So she knew if she was hearing these birds, she was about to make it to a river. And sure enough, pretty quickly, she stumbled into one. But unfortunately, it was not the kind of river she was looking for, or at least not the right portion of the river. There was a ton of debris. It was pretty much impassable by any boats. So she knew she wasn't going to find civilization in this area. She just had to keep following it. So that's exactly what she did. She swam through this river. Now, she had to keep, I believe, a stick in her hand because this river was filled with crocodiles, poisonous stingrays, and piranhas. But thankfully, she had grown up in the jungle and had learned it's really not as scary of a place as it's kind of made out to be, as long as you know the dangers exist and you know where they are and how to avoid them and handle them. She knew she'd be perfectly fine. She said at points these crocodiles were literally diving underneath of her from the bank, but none of them would ever mess with her. She knew how to, hit the ground to watch out for the different stingrays. It's absolutely insane how smart and brave the 17-year-old girl was. The days that she was swimming down this river, she heard search planes flying above her for days, going back and forth and back and forth, and it was defeating because the jungle was so thick, the canopy was so thick that there was nothing she could have done that would have gotten their attention. She just had to sit and know that safety was right above her and she couldn't get to it. And then after a couple of days, the planes stopped. At this point, the only thing that was really worrying her, because she knew she'd eventually find civilization, was the fact that a wound on her arm was infested at this point with bugs. And she was really worried that she was going to get blood poisoning, and that's not something that she could kind of deal with. Everything else, she could use survival skills, figure it out, but that was something that she wouldn't really be able to do much about. She tried to keep it as clean as possible. She tried to remove as many insects as she could, and she kept on pushing. One of the craziest things about this is that if she had gone the opposite direction, she likely would have been found within 2 or 3 days. because I believe if she'd gone the opposite direction, she would have been heading toward Pucallpa. But she ended up going the other way, so it took 11 days of wandering through the jungle for her to be found. Now, the 10th day, she was exhausted. At this point, she'd pretty much had nothing to eat. She had been drinking water from the river. Water was abundant in this jungle, but food not so much. And she described as feeling like she was in a semi-conscious sort of state. She was kind of losing touch with reality. Exhaustion was tearing her down completely, and she decided to go up on the bank of the river to rest for a little bit. And she said that she was going in and out of consciousness this entire time, but then all of a sudden she saw something. A boat on the other side of the river. She did not believe this was real at first, so she actually swam across the river because she wanted to touch it just to make sure, and sure enough, it was real. And then she noticed something else that she hadn't seen before either. There was a pathway leading from the boat up into the jungle, and I think it was like a 9-foot kind of hill, and she figured there might be a house or at least someone at the other side. And there were steps there, so she knew people eventually came to this location. She was so weak and exhausted that it took her hours. I think she said almost like all night or something like that to crawl up this 9-foot embankment because she was just so exhausted. When she finally made it up to the top of the path, she realized that there was a shelter up there, and she was so relieved that she at least would be able to get out of the elements. She ended up finding a can of gasoline, and she decided to use this to remove the bugs from the wound because she saw her dad do something similar to their dog at one point. So she sucked the gasoline out of this gas can, spit it onto her arm, and had to remove all of these bugs. And once she had done that, she laid down to rest. The next day, January 3rd, 1972, she was startled to hear the sound of voices in the jungle. And again, just like the boat, she was questioning if this was real or not. But sure enough, 3 lumbermen had come back to the shelter, and they discovered that Julianne was there. Now, at first, they were shocked to see her. Very, very shocked. They did not understand what was going on, but thankfully she spoke Spanish, and she was able to tell them what had happened, that she had been in the crash of Lanza Flight 508, and she needed help. They immediately jumped to help her. I mean, like right away, no hesitation. They helped her clean her wounds even further. They gave her a little bit of food, and then they put her in the boat and started the 7 to 11 day journey to the nearest village so that she could actually get medical attention and someone could come and help her. But once she got there, it was interesting because people were actually terrified of her. She got off the boat, and again, because her eyes were so swollen and they were completely bloodshot red, people were saying that she was a demon. She ended up having to be airlifted, and yes, you heard me say that, all the way to Pucallpa, where her father was, and she was reunited with him. Now, could you imagine 11 to 12 days after free falling out of a plane, being dropped in the middle of the Peruvian jungle and having to walk your way out of it for 11 to 12 days. Could you imagine again having to get into another plane? She was airlifted to safety. When she was in the hospital, she was treated for her wounds. She again had the different lacerations. She had the broken clavicle, but she also had 2nd-degree burns on her back from her back being exposed to the sun for so long while she was swimming through the river. She also found out at the hospital that she was the only survivor in the plane crash, and she heard about all of the searches that had gone on for days, and she also found out that on January 12th, while she was in the hospital, the remains of her mother had been found. And the thing that makes this so heartbreaking is that her mother had actually survived the crash too. Her mother managed to somehow survive the fall and succumb to her injuries days later, but she was laying in the jungle for days, and this messed Julianne up so bad. She was so overwhelmed with guilt, feeling like if she had just searched a little bit further, if she had tried a little bit harder, she might have been able to find her mom while she was still alive and helped her, or at least been able to say goodbye or something. That's a devastating thing to have to emotionally deal with. It took a long time for Julianne to recover, and once she did, she was kind of done with all of Peru. She decided to move back to Germany, where she was technically a citizen, and she decided to go to school, and she followed in both of her parents' footsteps and became a biologist. But interestingly enough, she ended up back in Peru to study bats. She has a book called When I Fell from the Sky, and she's even been interviewed by a man that was supposed to be on the flight, but last minute decided to not go on it. This is just the craziest set of circumstances, and I cannot fathom how she has managed to cope with all of this and continued on with her life. She said that she's developed these coping mechanisms to kind of keep her mind off of what happened and protect herself from all of the horrible memories. The search for this Lanza airplane was the largest search in Peruvian history. It took a long time for them to find it because if you remember, like I said, at 10,000 feet, the plane, she described it as just disappearing. Essentially, it just broke apart into a bunch of pieces. Some larger parts of it were together, but because of this, there was no very obvious crash site in the trees. They would look for things like broken limbs and everything like that, and they just weren't really seeing a lot of that. And then once they finally found the crash site, I think the main reason they found it was because the trees were just lined with people's belongings, clothes, shoes, suitcases, things that had just fallen from the sky. She's gone back to this site since then. She's walked the same exact path that she did before, or at least parts of it. I have no clue how she did that. I watched her do it in the documentary, and it's clear that she really has just entirely emotionally blocked this off because she seemed so unresponsive to pretty much everything, which is so heartbreaking, but I completely understand why she's built that wall. Some of the things that she found while walking the location were devastating, like a little coin purse from a little girl. There were suitcases, the metal around the perimeter of the suitcase. They kept finding those, and the locks were even still secured, but the rest of the suitcase was gone. They found, I think, one of the emergency exit doors, the hull of the plane, some of the siding. Some of this stuff has been taken and used as doors and different things in nearby villages. The area around the crash site you can barely even walk through because it's just littered with so much debris from the crash. There's carpet, there's parts of the electrical system. I mean, just left and right. There, I think, was even like a wallet or something. There's just stuff everywhere. There is a monument that was built for everyone that perished in the flight. I believe there were 91 passengers in total on the plane, and 60 of them are buried within this monument that's referred to as Wings of Hope. I don't know if that's because they never found all of the bodies, or if that's because some just didn't want their loved ones buried there. But it's someplace that she actually, I don't think, even saw until the documentary was made years later. Now, she's actually also spoken about how she believes she survived, and it's very, very fascinating. So I guess she has 3 reasons that she thinks all connected together are what saved her life. First of all, there are upward drafts that are created in thunderstorms, and there was a thunderstorm going on when she fell, so these upward drafts likely would have slowed down her fall quite a bit. And then on top of that, she was spiraling down. She wasn't just plummeting straight down, which again slows things down. So as you know, there are the 3 seats that were together. She was on the very end seat, which created a weight at that end and was just spinning her in circles. And then also the area where she fell, once they saw it afterwards, there was an absurd amount of vines in the trees. And it's likely that she actually hit these vines, which absorbed the impact, slowed her down to an extent, and essentially set her down on the ground compared to what would have happened otherwise. This story was absolutely insane to hear, and I just feel like it's crazy because given the circumstances that I talk about on a weekly basis and true crime and seeing how fast a life can be taken, and we really see these dark aspects covered on my channel constantly, but then seeing this and seeing how unbelievable it can seem and the circumstances in which someone can survive something so horrific, I just thought it was something very interesting to talk about and something to kind of show that while things might seem so defeating and simple with the rest of my content that I talk about, there are these other miracles, and I literally wouldn't call it anything other than that. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I want to thank you so much for watching, so much for liking, and also so much for subscribing to my channel and being a part of this Halloween week. It's been a lot of fun, and it's meant a lot to me, you guys. But I'm going to go ahead and go here. If you aren't already, hit the subscribe button so you can become a part of the Hallan fam so we can hopefully bring them home together. And on that note, I'm going to go, guys. Thank you so much. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.